In this video, we'll very briefly define and differentiate between stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination, which are interrelated but fundamentally different from one another. Understanding the differences between these terms will be important for future videos, so be sure to ask questions now if you have them. So first, we have stereotypes. A stereotype can be defined as a belief, positive or negative, and that's important, about the characteristics of members of a group that is applied generally, very broadly, to most or all members of that group. And stereotypes can lead to prejudice. Prejudice, in contrast to stereotypes are beliefs. Prejudice is sort of an attitude. It involves emotion. It involves drawing conclusions based on your beliefs. Again, stereotypes can lead to prejudice. These are related, but the phenomena themselves are fundamentally different from one another. So prejudice involves drawing negative conclusions about a person, a group of people, or some situation prior to evaluating the evidence. Again, typically based on your stereotypes of the person who's approaching you, their race, their gender, their clothing, whatever else it is. This can be called prejudice. And then finally, prejudice can lead to discrimination, which is negative behavior toward members of outgroups. Stereotypes are beliefs that can be positive or negative. Prejudice and discrimination can only be negative. Now, I used that term outgroups just then, and I want to define that. Outgroups refer to groups that you don't belong to, whereas in-groups refer to groups that you are in, right? Groups that you do belong to. If you're white, for example, someone who's black would be considered an outgroup member. Now, if you're paying close attention, however, you might object and say something like, well, what if you both identify as male? So you're white and this other person's black, but you're both men. In this case, wouldn't the other person be an in-group member as well because you share the same gender, even though your race is different? And the answer here is absolutely. And we have a name for this. We call this intersectionality, which in psychology and in many other disciplines refers to the study of the relationships among multiple dimensions of social identities and relationships. For example, intersectionality would involve investigating the experience of being a black woman, rather than only looking at race, only looking at the experience of being black, or only looking at gender, only looking at the experience of being a woman. So intersectionality is a relatively new approach in psychology, but it's a powerful way to more accurately describe people's social experiences in the world. Now, in this series of videos about the psychology of diversity, we will at times discuss social identities on their own, and at other times we'll discuss them together using this sort of an intersectional lens. And I really want you to pay attention to that because it is important. Okay, but I digress. Now that we've got all that out of the way, we'll get to it in future videos, but I just want to reiterate the main point of this slide here, which is to understand that stereotypes are beliefs, which can be positive or negative. Prejudice is an attitude, which is negative. It involves emotion. It involves drawing negative conclusions. It involves negative assumptions, whereas discrimination is fundamentally negative behavior. And that's the key fundamental difference between these three phenomena. Just to add a little bit more detail, stereotypes are generally negative. Now, I said that they can be positive, and I'm going to get back to that in just a moment, but they're generally negative. Most stereotypes we have are negative, and the ones we tend to investigate most often in psychology are negative because they tend to produce the most negative outcomes. Moreover, they're often inaccurate, and usually they are inaccurate. They're based on some false belief about the world, and we'll talk about many examples of those in this series of videos, and they're applied uniformly to the entire group, to everybody in that group. Now, again, I want to reiterate, stereotypes don't have to be negative. For example, believing that, Asians are good at math might be, or at least might seem positive, but this belief is still a stereotype. It's still a belief that you're applying uniformly to members of this group. Of course, if you think more deeply about it, some Asians are great at math, some Asians are horrible at math. Any group is going to have a wide variety. So it's an inaccurate sort of overgeneralization. This is what a stereotype is. As we'll see when we discuss, for example, benevolent sexism in a future video, even positive stereotypes, and I might put that in quotes, positive stereotypes and the like, can still produce negative outcomes for the stereotyped group. So it's still important to understand and to investigate the positive side of stereotypes as well. And as a final note, a couple of additional details or discussion about prejudice. I'm going to introduce here Gordon Allport's definition in 1954. Sadly, he is no longer with us. He passed away in 1967, but this definition has really endured. So he defined prejudice as an unjustified negative judgment of an individual based on that individual's social group identity. Maybe their race, maybe their gender, maybe myriad other aspects of their identities. So unjustified, why did he use this term? Because it's applied prior to evaluating the evidence. It's unjustified because typically it's when you first meet this person, you already have all of these assumptions or expectations about them based on just their appearance, what you can visibly tell from them. And chances are, if you were to get to know them, you might find out they're terrible at math, or they're amazing in this other way, or whatever, right? Idiosyncratic to that person is going to be all sorts of things that you don't know just by looking at them. And so prejudice typically involves this unjustified, automatic response. And finally, negative. Prejudice is negative, and it involves feelings. It involves emotions. These negative judgments are typically the result of negative feelings, again, typically the result of negative stereotypes. So it's all intertwined with one another. And these emotions can include sort of fear of this group or resentment of this group or whatever, but it's a negative sort of emotion. And you can easily see how negative emotions might lead to negative behaviors, which is what we call discrimination.